Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of the Missouri Ozarks. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The year was 1887, and the Ozark Mountains of Missouri stood, as they always had, silent sentinels of countless untold stories. Among the rolling hills and dense forests of Douglas County, approximately 12 miles from the town of Ava, stood a modest two-story farmhouse owned by the Harper sisters. To travelers on the old post road connecting Springfield to West Plains, the Harper homestead represented a welcome respite from the journey. The sisters, Abigail and Martha Harper, were known throughout the region for their hospitality. Their home served as an unofficial way station for weary travelers, offering a warm meal and, if necessary, lodging for the night at reasonable rates. The Harper sisters had inherited the property from their father, Ezekiel Harper, a once prosperous cattle farmer who had passed away in 1879. Following his death, the unmarried sisters, then in their early 30s, converted portions of their family home to accommodate overnight guests. They maintained a small livestock operation and vegetable garden, but primarily sustained themselves through the modest income generated from travelers seeking shelter along the difficult mountain routes. The sisters were described as pleasant, if somewhat reserved. Abigail, the elder at 42, handled most interactions with guests, while Martha, 3 years younger, was known for her exceptional cooking. Local residents from Ava and surrounding communities spoke well of the sisters, though few claimed close relationships with them. The Harpers kept to themselves, venturing into town only for supplies and church services. According to accounts recorded in the Ava Weekly Herald, Abigail was a tall, angular woman with prematurely graying hair that she kept pulled back in a severe bun. Her demeanor was described as formal and businesslike, though she could display a measured warmth when the situation called for it. Martha, in contrast, was shorter and more robust in build, with dark hair and what several accounts described as unusually pale blue eyes. While Abigail managed the business affairs and interacted with guests, Martha rarely engaged in conversation, preferring to communicate through nods and brief responses while she attended to household duties. The Harper home itself was a substantial structure for the region, built by Ezekiel in the 1860s using native oak and limestone quarried from the surrounding hills. It featured 4 guest rooms on the second floor, with the sisters occupying a small bedroom behind the kitchen on the ground level. A large attic space ran the length of the house, accessed by a narrow staircase at the rear of the building. The property also included a barn, smokehouse, root cellar, and various outbuildings, typical of a small farming operation of that era. Travelers' accounts, later collected during the investigation, described the interior as meticulously maintained but notably sparse in decoration. The walls were unadorned save for a few religious texts and a large map of Missouri that hung in the main sitting room. The furnishings were sturdy and functional rather than decorative. Several guests commented on the unusual thickness of the interior walls and the heaviness of the doors, which Abigail explained as necessary insulation against the harsh Ozark winters. The troubling events that would later become known as the Harper Sisters Incident began to unfold in late autumn of 1887, when a postal inspector named Thomas Whitfield failed to arrive at his scheduled appointment in West Plains. What initially appeared to be a routine delay soon developed into a regional concern when Whitfield's horse was found wandering riderless near Bryant Creek, approximately 3 miles from the Harper property. Whitfield had been dispatched from the regional postal headquarters in Springfield to investigate reports of mail tampering along the southern routes. His official correspondence, recovered from his saddlebags, indicated that he had visited several post offices along his journey and had documented some minor irregularities, though nothing that suggested serious criminal activity. His last recorded entry, dated November 12, 1887, noted his intention to stay at the Harper establishment before continuing to West Plains the following day. A search party organized by Sheriff James Burwell of Douglas County found no immediate signs of the missing inspector. His saddlebags were intact, containing official correspondence and a small amount of money, suggesting robbery was not a motive. The search was eventually suspended due to heavy November rains that made the mountain terrain treacherous. Sheriff Burwell, a veteran lawman who had served in the position since 1882, noted in his report that disappearances in the remote Ozark region were not uncommon, particularly during the harsh winter months when travelers could easily become disoriented in sudden storms or fall victim to the treacherous terrain. When questioned initially about Whitfield, the Harper sisters confirmed that the postal inspector had indeed stayed at their home on the night of November 12th. According to their account, he had enjoyed a hearty dinner of rabbit stew and cornbread, retired early complaining of a mild headache, and departed after breakfast the following morning, appearing in good health and spirits. They expressed appropriate concern upon learning of his disappearance, but suggested that he might have taken an alternate route to West Plains that would have led him through particularly rugged country where accidents were common. The matter might have remained an unfortunate but ultimately forgotten incident had it not been for the subsequent disappearance of a livestock buyer named Frederick Miller in December of that same year. Miller, a representative of the St. Louis Meatpacking Company, had been traveling through the region purchasing cattle for winter slaughter. According to company records, his last known location was the Harper homestead, where he had intended to negotiate the purchase of their small herd. Miller was described in company documents as an experienced cattle buyer who had worked throughout the Midwest for over 15 years. At 47 years of age, he was known for his meticulous record-keeping and reliability. His failure to report in or return to St. Louis prompted the company to contact authorities in several counties along his known route. A colleague who had worked with Miller for many years later testified that the man was as dependable as sunrise and that his disappearance was entirely out of character. The coincidence of two professional men vanishing within weeks of each other along the same stretch of road prompted a more thorough investigation. Sheriff Burwell, accompanied by 3 deputies, paid a visit to the Harper property in early January 1888. According to the sheriff's report filed with the county clerk on January 7th, the sisters were forthcoming and cooperative, explaining that both Whitfield and Miller had indeed stayed at their home, each for a single night, before departing the following morning to continue their respective journeys. Regarding Miller, the sisters provided a detailed account of his visit. He had arrived in the late afternoon of December 18th, they claimed, and had examined their small herd of cattle before determining that the animals did not meet the quality standards required by his company. He had nonetheless accepted their offer of dinner and lodging, planning to continue toward Mountain Grove the next day, where another sale was scheduled. Like Whitfield before him, the sisters maintained that Miller had departed their property in apparent good health, traveling eastward on horseback. The sisters permitted a cursory search of the premises, which revealed nothing suspicious. The guest rooms appeared ordinary, if somewhat austere, and the outbuildings contained nothing beyond the expected tools and supplies of a small farming operation. In the absence of evidence suggesting foul play, the investigation stalled. The prevailing theory held that both men had fallen victim to either the treacherous terrain or, more likely, to the notorious Bald Knobbers, vigilante groups that operated throughout the Ozarks during that period, known for administering their own brutal form of frontier justice. The Bald Knobbers, who took their name from the bald hilltops or knobs where they often met, had emerged in the region following the Civil War as self-appointed guardians of public order. While they initially formed to combat the lawlessness that plagued the isolated communities of the Ozarks, by the 1880s, many of these groups had devolved into instruments of personal vendettas and local power struggles. Their activities were known to be particularly violent in Taney and Christian counties, though Douglas County had experienced less of their influence. Nevertheless, the possibility of vigilante action provided a convenient explanation for disappearances that otherwise lacked clear causes. As winter gave way to spring, the disappearances faded from public concern. The Harper sisters continued to operate their small lodging establishment, though locals later reported that the frequency of travelers stopping at their property seemed to diminish. Whether this was due to whispered suspicions or simply the natural ebb and flow of commercial traffic remains unclear. Samuel Jenkins, the owner of the general store in Ava, recalled in a later statement that the sisters' visits to town became less frequent during this period. When they did appear to purchase supplies, he noted a change in their demeanor, a new wariness, particularly in Abigail, who had previously been cordial if reserved in her interactions. She had taken to scanning the street before entering the store, Jenkins reported, and would often position herself to keep the door in view while conducting her business. He attributed this behavior to the natural caution of women living alone in a remote area, especially following the unsolved disappearances that had occurred in the vicinity of their property. Another local resident, Emma Caldwell, who occasionally assisted with laundry at the Harper home, reported observing unusual modifications to the property during her visits that spring. Additional locks had been installed on several doors, including those to the attic and root cellar, which Abigail explained as necessary precautions against intrusion by unprincipled persons. Mrs. Caldwell also noted that certain areas of the house were now explicitly off-limits, with Martha becoming visibly agitated on one occasion when the laundress inadvertently attempted to enter the attic stairwell. It wasn't until April 1888 that circumstances took an unexpected turn. A land surveyor named Jeremiah Oakes, employed by the Missouri Pacific Railroad to scout potential routes for a new spur line, arrived in Douglas County. Oakes took a room at the Harper homestead on April 18th, intending to use it as a base of operations while he conducted his survey work in the surrounding hills. Oakes was 36 years old, a veteran of numerous surveying expeditions throughout the Midwest. His journal, recovered among his possessions, recorded his initial impressions of the Harper sisters and their establishment. Accommodations simple but adequate. Elder sister businesslike, younger one peculiar, watches constantly but speaks hardly at all. Excellent food, though seasoned strangely. Location well suited to my purposes, with good access to the North Ridge where preliminary measurements suggest favorable grade for potential route. Unlike the previous missing men, Oakes did not disappear. Instead, he fled the Harper property in the early morning hours of April 20th, arriving in Ava just after dawn in a state that witnesses described as highly agitated and near collapse from exhaustion. Oakes immediately sought out Sheriff Burwell, to whom he delivered a disturbing account. According to the statement recorded by the sheriff's clerk, Oakes claimed that on his second night at the Harper home, he had been awakened shortly after midnight by what he initially thought was a dream, the sensation of being watched. Opening his eyes, he perceived a figure standing motionless in the darkened doorway of his room. Thinking it was one of the sisters attending to some household matter, he called out softly but received no response. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, Oakes realized the silhouette belonged to Martha Harper. What alarmed him was not her presence, but her posture and appearance. She stood unnaturally rigid, her head tilted at an odd angle, staring at him with what he described as eyes that reflected the faint moonlight like those of nocturnal animal. Most disturbing was her complete silence and stillness. She neither spoke nor moved for what Oakes estimated was nearly 5 minutes. In his statement, Oakes recounted feeling an inexplicable sensation of paralysis during this encounter, an inability to move or call out that he initially attributed to the natural disorientation of being awakened suddenly. It was as if her gaze itself held me in place, he reported, though I recognize how fanciful that sounds in the telling. He described experiencing an unusual metallic taste in his mouth and a faint ringing in his ears, symptoms he had never before experienced. Eventually, without a word, she retreated from the doorway. Thoroughly unsettled, Oakes rose and quietly approached the door, intending to secure it. To his shock, there was no lock or latch. As he stood contemplating this, he heard soft footsteps ascending the stairs. Peering cautiously into the hallway, he observed both sisters moving silently up the steps toward the attic, carrying what appeared to be a large covered basket between them. The basket, Oakes noted, seemed unusually heavy, requiring the effort of both women to carry it. More disturbing was their manner of movement, synchronized and deliberate, without exchanging words or glances, as if performing a routine they had enacted countless times before. The surveyor observed that they took particular care to avoid allowing the basket to touch the walls of the narrow stairwell, suggesting that its contents were either fragile or needed to remain undisturbed. Convinced that something was deeply wrong, Oakes returned to his room, dressed hastily, and gathered his belongings. He intended to depart immediately, but feared that attempting to leave might alert the sisters. Instead, he decided to wait until dawn. However, his anxiety intensified when, approximately an hour later, he heard the sisters descending the stairs and moving about the first floor. The sound that finally prompted his flight was a rhythmic scraping noise from the kitchen, what he described as the sound of a heavy knife being repeatedly sharpened. Abandoning any pretense of caution, Oakes climbed through his bedroom window, dropped to the ground below, and fled on foot through the forest, leaving his horse and survey equipment behind. In the light of day, Oakes's account might have seemed the product of an overactive imagination, or perhaps a nightmare that had blurred the line between sleep and wakefulness. Indeed, Sheriff Burwell initially approached the surveyor's story with skepticism, particularly given the respectable standing of the Harper sisters in the community. However, when Oakes mentioned the disappearances of Whitfield and Miller, expressing his conviction that whatever happened to those men began in that attic, the sheriff's professional instincts were sufficiently aroused to warrant further investigation. Sheriff Burwell found Oakes's account compelling enough to warrant another, more thorough investigation of the Harper property. Assembling a posse of 6 men, including Dr. William Fletcher, the county physician, he rode out to the homestead later that same day. They arrived to find the house apparently deserted. The sisters' horses remained in the stable, but there was no immediate sign of the women. The approaching party noticed several unusual details about the property that had not been documented during the previous, more cursory investigation. The curtains had been drawn on all windows, despite the pleasant spring weather. A thin column of smoke rose from the chimney of the smokehouse, suggesting recent activity. Most notably, the front door of the main house stood slightly ajar, an oddity given the sisters' reputation for meticulousness in maintaining their home. A methodical search of the premises revealed several disturbing discoveries. In the kitchen, a large collection of knives and butchering tools was found, all meticulously maintained but showing signs of heavy use, inconsistent with the modest needs of a small household. Several of these implements were of unusual design, with specialized blades and handles that Dr. Fletcher later testified were similar to surgical instruments he had observed during his medical training in St. Louis. The dining room and parlor appeared ordinary, though deputies noted an unusual number of thick wool rugs covering the plank flooring. When these were lifted, faint staining was visible on the wood beneath, discoloration that Dr. Fletcher suggested was consistent with blood that had been repeatedly cleaned, but had nevertheless penetrated the grain of the wood. The guest rooms on the second floor similarly showed evidence of extensive cleaning, with the distinct odor of lye soap and carbolic acid detectable, despite apparent efforts to mask these scents with dried lavender and pine boughs. The root cellar contained an unusually large supply of preserved meats for a property with only a small livestock operation. The jars were meticulously labeled with dates and cryptic designations that consisted of initials and numbers, Dr. Fletcher, examining the contents of several containers, expressed uncertainty about the origin of some of the preserved materials, noting that the texture and appearance did not correspond to any conventional livestock he was familiar with. He refrained from specifying his suspicions in the initial report, noting only that further analysis would be required to determine the precise nature of certain preserved substances. Most troubling was what the search party found in the attic, a space that had been converted into what Dr. Fletcher described in his subsequent report as a workshop of deeply concerning nature. Unlike the rest of the house, which maintained at least the appearance of ordinary domesticity, the attic had been transformed into a space devoted entirely to activities of a sinister nature. The attic contained 2 tables of sturdy construction, equipped with leather restraints. The surfaces of these tables were stained dark despite evidence of scrubbing, and deep grooves had been cut into the wood, apparently to channel fluids toward collection vessels positioned at one end. A variety of surgical instruments and butchering tools were arranged on a nearby workbench, organized with a precision that suggested frequent and systematic use. Large dark stains permeated the wooden floor, which Dr. Fletcher identified as blood, though he noted in his report that the quantity suggested repeated use of the space for activities involving significant bloodletting. The walls of this workshop space had been lined with layers of quilts and heavy blankets, which Sheriff Burwell speculated were intended to muffle sounds from reaching the floor below or carrying beyond the house. A small cast-iron stove provided heat, its chimney connecting to the main flue of the house in such a way that smoke from this separate fire would not be distinguishable from that of the kitchen hearth below, a design that suggested deliberate concealment of activities in this space. Adjacent to this workshop was a smaller room containing numerous personal effects, wallets, pocket watches, clothing items, official badges, and other articles that could be traced to at least 7 different individuals, including items belonging to the missing Postal Inspector Whitfield and cattle buyer Miller. Most of these items were carefully cataloged and labeled with dates, suggesting a methodical record-keeping system. A leather-bound journal found in this room contained entries in Abigail Harper's distinctive handwriting detailing what she referred to as procedures conducted on various dates. The clinical language employed in these descriptions suggested a disturbing detachment from the human implications of the activities being recorded. References to specimens, extractions, and preservation methods were interspersed with observations about the quality and viability of materials obtained from what the journal euphemistically termed sources. The sisters themselves were nowhere to be found, having apparently fled shortly before or during the posse's approach. A wider search of the property led to the grim discovery of a series of shallow graves in a remote clearing approximately a quarter-mile behind the house. These graves, concealed beneath carefully arranged rock formations that would appear natural to casual observation, contained human remains in various states of decomposition. What troubled investigators most about these burial sites was evidence suggesting that the interments had not been performed out of any sense of respect for the deceased or desire to conceal crimes. Rather, the bodies appeared to have been systematically processed before burial, with certain elements removed in a methodical fashion that Dr. Fletcher reluctantly described as harvesting. The specific nature of these removals suggested knowledge of human anatomy beyond what would be expected of individuals without medical training. Due to the approaching evening and the disturbing nature of the findings, Sheriff Burwell suspended further excavation until the following day, posting deputies to secure the scene overnight. The men drew lots to determine watch rotations, with none expressing eagerness to remain at the property after dark. Deputy Michael Collins, who drew the first watch, later reported experiencing an acute sense of being observed from the surrounding forest throughout his shift, though no actual sightings of the sisters or other individuals were recorded. When the search party returned on April 21st, they made an additional discovery that compounded the horror. A well-constructed smokehouse hidden within a dense thicket, containing what Dr. Fletcher reluctantly confirmed were preserved human remains. The structure had been built to resemble a natural formation from the exterior, with its entrance concealed by a carefully arranged pile of deadfall and its chimney disguised as a hollow tree stump. Only the most thorough search would have revealed its presence. The interior of this hidden smokehouse contained racks upon which hung various preserved materials that Dr. Fletcher, despite his professional experience with human anatomy, had difficulty describing in his official report. He noted only that the items represented parts of human anatomy prepared using methods typically employed in the preservation of meat products, adding that the systematic nature of the processing suggested considerable experience and a disturbing level of comfort with the procedures involved. The process of identification was complicated by the condition of the bodies, but personal effects found with some of the remains allowed for tentative identification of several missing persons, including Whitfield and Miller. Subsequent investigation would eventually connect at least 9 sets of remains to individuals who had been reported missing along the postal route between Springfield and West Plains over the preceding 8 years. The revelation of these atrocities sent shockwaves through the region. The Springfield Daily Republican published a front-page article on April 25, 1888, with the headline, "Horror in the Ozarks. Harper sisters sought for unspeakable crimes." The article, while avoiding the most gruesome details, suggested that the sisters had been operating their deadly enterprise for potentially years before suspicions arose. The Republican's report, written by veteran correspondent Edward Pembroke, approached the subject with the restrained language typical of the era, referring to acts contrary to both law and nature, and processing of human remains in a manner suggesting consumption. Despite this circumspection, the implications were clear enough to trigger widespread horror and fascination among the readership. Pembroke speculated that the sisters' remote location and reputation for hospitality had created the perfect conditions for their activities to continue undetected for years. As news of the discoveries spread, other travelers came forward with accounts of unsettling experiences at the Harper homestead. Several reported awakening during the night with inexplicable feelings of heaviness or paralysis, which they had attributed to exhaustion or illness. Others recalled unusual tasting food or beverages that had left them disoriented and weak. These reports suggested that the sisters may have employed some form of sedative to incapacitate their victims. A commercial drummer named Henry Aldrich, who had stayed at the Harper home twice during his circuit through the region, recalled that on his second visit in early 1887, he had awakened during the night feeling strangely disconnected from my own limbs. Unable to move or call out, he had observed Martha Harper standing in his doorway, watching him for several minutes before departing. Aldrich had attributed the experience to a nightmare at the time, but had nonetheless decided to seek alternative accommodations during subsequent journeys through the area. Similarly, a cattle drover named James Wheeler reported that after dining at the Harper home in 1886, he had experienced such profound lethargy that he had been unable to depart as planned the following morning. The sisters had been solicitous, offering him an additional night's lodging at no charge. Wheeler recalled that the younger sister, Martha, had brought him a special tea that she claimed would restore his vigor. After drinking it, his recollection of the subsequent 12 hours was entirely absent, a circumstance he had attributed to illness, but which, in light of subsequent revelations, took on more sinister implications. Laboratory analysis of food items recovered from the Harper kitchen, conducted by a chemist at the Missouri Medical College in St. Louis, identified the presence of several substances known to produce sedative effects, including extracts from Jimson weed and certain fungal compounds. These findings supported the theory that the sisters had systematically drugged their intended victims before moving them to the attic workshop. A manhunt for the Harper sisters extended throughout the summer of 1888, covering the Ozarks and expanding into Arkansas, Kansas, and Indian Territory. Despite the efforts of multiple law enforcement agencies, the women seem to have vanished entirely. Theories abounded regarding their disappearance. Some believed they had disguised themselves and fled to a major city, while others suggested they had met with violence themselves at the hands of accomplices or vigilantes. Sheriff Burwell coordinated with authorities in neighboring counties and states, distributing detailed descriptions of the sisters along with the offer of a substantial reward for information leading to their capture. The wanted notices described Abigail as approximately 5'10", tall, slender build, with gray-streaked dark hair and brown eyes, noting her precise manner of speech and rigid posture. Martha was described as 5'4", stockier in build with dark hair and pale blue eyes, noted for her minimal speech and tendency to observe intensely without expression. The case attracted attention from law enforcement far beyond the Ozarks region. Pinkerton detectives from the agency's St. Louis office joined the investigation in May 1888, bringing with them techniques that were advanced for the time, including systematic interviews of all known travelers along the postal routes adjacent to the Harper property, and the compilation of a timeline of disappearances that might be connected to the sisters' activities. The Pinkerton investigation uncovered evidence suggesting that the Harpers' activities might have begun even earlier than initially suspected. Records indicated that travelers had been disappearing along that stretch of the Ozarks since at least 1880, the year following Ezekiel Harper's death. While some of these disappearances had prompted searches at the time, the rugged terrain and isolated nature of the region had made thorough investigation difficult. In most cases, the missing persons had been assumed victims of accident, exposure, or possibly violence from the numerous outlaws who took refuge in the remote hollows and caves of the Ozarks. The case took another unexpected turn in October 1888, when a hunter discovered an abandoned cabin near the Arkansas border, approximately 40 miles from the Harper property. Inside, authorities found evidence suggesting the sisters had briefly occupied the space, including a journal written in what was later confirmed as Abigail Harper's handwriting. The journal contained entries dating from April through June 1888, providing a disturbing glimpse into the sisters' activities and mindset. The hunter, Elijah Thornton, had been tracking deer through a particularly remote section of the Boston Mountains when he came upon the cabin, which he initially believed to be an abandoned trapper's outpost. Upon entering to seek shelter during a rainstorm, Thornton discovered items that he recognized from newspaper descriptions as potentially connected to the Harper case. With commendable civic responsibility, he traveled 2 days to reach the nearest sheriff's office in Carroll County, Arkansas, to report his discovery. Arkansas authorities, in cooperation with Sheriff Burwell, secured the site and conducted a thorough investigation. The cabin itself was a crude structure, consisting of a single room with a small hearth. Evidence suggested a hasty departure. Personal items had been left behind, including clothing identifiable as belonging to the sisters and the journal that would prove crucial to understanding the psychological underpinnings of their crimes. The journal revealed that the Harpers had not always been killers. The earliest entries suggested that their father, Ezekiel, had initiated them into what the journal referred to as the necessary work. According to Abigail's writings, Ezekiel Harper had harbored deep-seated grievances against travelers and outsiders whom he blamed for undisclosed past traumas. He had apparently taught his daughters to view certain visitors, particularly men of official or professional standing, as deserving of their fate. Abigail wrote of her father's teachings with a disturbing reverence. Father showed us that the outsiders bring corruption and weakness. They come with their papers and their measuring and their taxes, taking what isn't theirs to take. Father taught us that there is power in the taking back, in returning to ourselves what they would drain away. He showed us how to recognize those who carry the most potent essences and how to extract what strengthens us. Following their father's death, the sisters had continued what they now regarded as a family tradition. Abigail's journal entries displayed a disturbing lack of remorse, instead revealing a methodical approach to selecting, subduing, and ultimately disposing of their victims. Most unsettling was the matter-of-fact tone with which she detailed their techniques for preserving various materials from their victims, a practice that the journal suggested had both practical and ritualistic significance for the sisters. Entries from the period immediately following their flight from the homestead revealed a growing tension between the sisters. Abigail wrote of Martha becoming increasingly erratic and speaking of voices that I cannot hear. She expressed concern that her younger sister was forgetting father's teachings about discretion and purpose, suggesting that Martha had begun to kill indiscriminately rather than according to their established criteria. The final entries in the journal grew increasingly paranoid and disjointed, suggesting that Abigail, at least, had begun to experience significant psychological deterioration. She wrote of feeling watched by those we've incorporated and sensing their essence turning against us from within. References to the hunger that never ceases and dreams filled with faces that change but wear the same expression suggest a mind fracturing under the weight of its own terrible actions. The last coherent entry, dated June 8, 1888, contained a cryptic reference to returning to the old ways and seeking shelter where we first learned our purpose. This led investigators to speculate that the sisters might have returned to some location connected to their childhood or early years with their father. Despite this potential lead, the trail went cold. The subsequent investigation into the sisters' background revealed that the Harper family had moved to Missouri from eastern Tennessee in 1862 during the Civil War. Records indicated that Ezekiel Harper had been widowed shortly after arrival in the Ozarks, leaving him solely responsible for his daughter's upbringing in an isolated environment during a period of significant regional violence and instability. Parish records from Washington County, Tennessee, documented the Harper family's departure following an incident described only as unfortunate accusations against Mr. Harper regarding the disappearance of a tax assessor. While no formal charges had been filed, the implication that Ezekiel Harper's antipathy toward government officials might have manifested in violence even before the family's relocation to Missouri added a disturbing dimension to the generational nature of the Harper sisters' crimes. Neighbors who had known the family during this earlier period recalled that Ezekiel had been a reclusive figure who discouraged interactions between his daughters and the outside world. Several accounts mentioned that he had been particularly hostile toward government officials, railroad men, and others he perceived as representing outside interests, notably similar to the profile of victims later targeted by his daughters. Hiram Blackwood, who had owned a farm adjacent to the Harper property during the 1870s, provided a statement describing Ezekiel as a man who kept to himself but watched others with uncommon intensity. Blackwood recounted occasional interactions during which Harper had expressed views that, in retrospect, seemed ominous. He had strange notions about strength being something that could be taken from one person and given to another, Blackwood recalled. Spoke of certain men, especially those in positions of authority, as having qualities worth harvesting, though I took it as odd farmers' talk at the time. As months passed without sightings of the sisters, public interest in the case gradually waned. The Harper property was eventually sold at public auction, with proceeds directed to a fund established for the families of identified victims. The house itself was demolished by its new owner, who claimed to have no interest in preserving what had become locally known as the Butcher House. Local residents reported that even the salvageable timber from the structure found no buyers, as no one wished to incorporate materials from the Harper home into their own dwellings. The official investigation remained open but inactive until a surprising development in September 1889. A Methodist circuit rider named Reverend Samuel Holcomb reported encountering two women matching the Harper sisters' description at a remote mining settlement in the Boston Mountains of northern Arkansas. According to Reverend Holcomb, the women were living under the names Margaret and Elizabeth Wilson and operating a small boarding house catering to miners. Holcomb, who traveled throughout the Ozark region delivering sermons and performing baptisms and marriages in communities too small to support permanent clergy, had spent a single night at the Wilson sisters' establishment. In his statement to authorities, he described feeling uneasy in their presence, particularly noting that the younger sister seemed to watch me with an unblinking intensity that I found most disturbing. It was only upon returning to a larger town and seeing a wanted notice that he made the connection between the Wilson sisters and the fugitive Harpers. Authorities from both Missouri and Arkansas converged on the settlement, only to find that the women had departed approximately 2 weeks earlier, after rumors began circulating among the miners about their unusual behavior during nighttime hours. Witness accounts described the women becoming increasingly reclusive and suspicious in the days before their disappearance, speaking in whispers to each other and watching their boarders with unsettling intensity. A miner named Thomas Rutledge reported that he had awakened one night to find both women standing in his room, observing him silently. When he called out, the younger one had made a sound that he described as more animal than human, before the elder pulled her from the room. Rutledge had shared this experience with his colleagues the following day, generating widespread unease in the small community. The women had disappeared that same night, leaving behind most of their possessions. This would prove to be the last credible sighting of the Harper sisters. Despite periodic reports over the following years of women matching their description in locations ranging from Texas to Colorado, none of these leads produced concrete results. The official investigation was formally closed in 1895, with the sisters presumed either deceased or having successfully established new identities in some distant location. The case of the Harper sisters faded into regional folklore, occasionally revived in newspaper retrospectives or collections of Ozark mysteries. What prevented it from becoming merely another lurid tale of frontier violence was the discovery made in 1907 during the construction of a new county road near the original Harper property. Workers excavating a section of hillside approximately 1 mile from the former homestead uncovered a small cave entrance that had been carefully concealed with stones and vegetation. Inside, they discovered what appeared to be a much older version of the workshop found in the Harper attic, a space that showed evidence of use dating back decades before the sisters' crimes came to light. The cave had been modified extensively, with crude shelving carved into the limestone walls and the floor leveled with flat stones. Rusted tools and implements of disturbing design were found arranged precisely on a stone ledge, suggesting the same methodical approach observed in the sisters' attic workshop. Fragments of leather restraints attached to a central stone slab presented an unmistakable parallel to the tables found in the Harper house. Among the items recovered from this hidden space was a leather-bound ledger containing entries dating from 1864 to 1878, written in a masculine hand presumed to be Ezekiel Harper's. The ledger contained methodical records of at least 22 individuals who had contributed to the continuation of the work, along with detailed notes on techniques for extracting and preserving various materials from these unfortunates. The entries suggested that Ezekiel had established this location shortly after the family's arrival in Missouri, using it as his primary workspace until declining health in his later years had necessitated moving these activities closer to home, presumably to the attic space that his daughters would later maintain and expand. The documentation of his techniques was explicit and detailed, suggesting that he had intended the ledger as an instructional text for his daughters. Most disturbing was evidence suggesting that Ezekiel had been inducted into these practices by his own father in their former home in Tennessee, representing a lineage of calculated violence potentially spanning generations. The ledger made references to ancient beliefs regarding the consumption of certain human materials as a means of absorbing strength and extending life, superstitions that had apparently mutated over time into a family doctrine. References within the ledger to the old knowledge brought from across the ocean suggested that these practices might have originated in European folk beliefs, perhaps connected to the Harper family's ancestral origins. Ezekiel wrote of traditions passed through the male line for untold generations, describing himself as a custodian of practices that he believed essential to preserve. His decision to instruct his daughters, rather than allow the tradition to end with his death, represented a deviation from this patrilineal transmission, one that he justified as necessary to ensure the continuation of what he termed the harvest. The discovery of this evidence reframed understanding of the Harper sisters not simply as aberrant killers, but as the most recent practitioners of a family tradition of ritualized violence, stretching back to antebellum Tennessee. The question that has lingered in the minds of those familiar with the case is whether this tradition truly ended with Abigail and Martha's disappearance, or whether, like their father before them, they might have found some way to pass their terrible knowledge to another generation. Douglas County historical records indicate that following the discovery of the cave, local residents reported increased unease about the area surrounding the former Harper property. Stories circulated about unusual sounds emanating from the deeper hollows, particularly on moonless nights. While such accounts can be readily attributed to the power of suggestion following the sensational revelations about the cave's contents, they led to the abandonment of several homesteads in the vicinity and the rerouting of the postal road to avoid passing near the former Harper land. The final official record relating to the Harper case is a brief report filed by the Douglas County Sheriff's Office in 1912, noting that an elderly female patient at the state hospital in Nevada, Missouri, had claimed on her deathbed to be Martha Harper. The woman, who had been committed under the name Mary Wilson in 1904 following an incident in which she attacked a boarding house operator with a kitchen knife, provided details about the Harper homestead and crimes that were never publicly disclosed. According to the attending physician, Dr. James Littlefield, the woman had maintained an almost complete silence during her 8 years at the institution until the final days of her life, when she began speaking in a surprisingly lucid manner about events connected to the Harper case. She described specific aspects of the sisters' methodology that had been deliberately withheld from newspaper accounts, lending credibility to her claim of first-hand knowledge. Most notably, she spoke of the family recipe for a sedative compound derived from multiple plant sources, the specific composition of which matched exactly what the chemist from Missouri Medical College had identified in the samples taken from the Harper kitchen. She also accurately described the precise arrangement of the workshop tables in the attic and the system of drainage channels that had been constructed to collect and preserve certain fluids, details known only to investigators who had examined the scene. According to Dr. Littlefield's notes, the woman's final words were a warning that the sisters are always watching for suitable guests and that hospitality runs in our blood. Whether this represented the genuine final testimony of Martha Harper or merely the ramblings of a disturbed individual familiar with the notorious case cannot be determined with certainty. The hospital records indicate only that the woman died on October 17, 1912, and was buried in an unmarked grave in the institution's cemetery. An interesting footnote to this potential conclusion appeared in county records dated 1913, noting that an elderly woman identifying herself as Agnes Collins had attempted to claim the remains for private burial, stating that she was a family relation. When asked to provide documentation of this relationship, the woman had become agitated and fled the hospital grounds. Subsequent investigation revealed no record of an Agnes Collins connected to either the Harper or Wilson families. The description of this woman, while vague, noted that she was tall and rigid in bearing, with gray hair and an unsettling intensity to her gaze, characteristics consistent with the descriptions of Abigail Harper. To this day, the wooded hills surrounding the former Harper property remain the subject of local superstitions. Residents of Douglas County still occasionally report encountering two women of indeterminate age standing silently among the trees at dusk, watching the road with peculiar intensity. These accounts are dismissed by authorities as folklore perpetuating itself through suggestion and the power of the original story to imprint itself on the imagination. Local historian Eleanor Simmons, who has extensively researched the Harper case, notes that the sisters represent a particular type of fear deeply embedded in the American consciousness, the fear of false hospitality in remote places. The idea that someone might invite you into their home, not out of kindness, but with predatory intent, speaks to the vulnerability we all feel when traveling through isolated regions, Simmons wrote in her 1962 monograph on Ozark folklore. The Harper sisters embody the dark potential that lurks behind the veneer of rural hospitality. What makes the Harper case particularly disturbing from a historical perspective is not merely the nature of their crimes, but the suggestion that they represented merely one link in a chain of inherited violence, stretching back generations and potentially forward into the future. If the woman who died in the state hospital in 1912 was indeed Martha Harper, and if the woman who sought her remains was Abigail, then the possibility exists that the sisters might have perpetuated their family tradition through adoption or instruction of others during the decades they spent in hiding. Yet it is worth noting that even now, more than 7 decades after these events, travelers through the remote sections of the Missouri Ozarks often comment on a peculiar reluctance to accept offers of shelter from strangers living in isolated areas, a cultural memory of hospitality that concealed unspeakable intentions. Tour guides in the region sometimes reference the Harper sisters when explaining the origin of this caution, though they typically sanitize the details of the case for more sensitive audiences. The Harper sisters remain a troubling footnote in the history of American crime, not for the number of their victims, which was relatively modest compared to other notorious cases, but for the methodical nature of their activities and the suggestion that they represented merely 2 links in a longer chain of inherited violence. Their disappearance without resolution has kept their story alive in the regional consciousness, a reminder that in the most isolated corners of the country, ancient practices may persist unseen, disguised behind the mask of ordinary life. As we conclude this account, consider this. The Harper sisters were eventually exposed not through any mistake in their careful methodology, but because of an uncharacteristic moment of curiosity, Martha's silent observation of a guest who happened to awaken at the wrong moment. One might wonder how many other travelers through the Ozarks in those years sensed something watching them in the darkness, but unlike Jeremiah Oakes, failed to escape before that watching presence became something far worse. The next time you find yourself accepting hospitality in a remote location, you might do well to remember the Harper sisters of Douglas County, kind hosts by day, something else entirely by night. And perhaps before you drift into sleep, take a moment to ensure your door has a functioning lock.